It's always just between us, all right?
Sharing relationship issues and also inspiring stories that will move and uplift you. You're listening to Between Us. I'm Angela Lim. Great to have you here with us. Now, today we're going to find out a little bit more about why relationships break down, some common mistakes we all make that perpetuate conflict in our relationships, and also, more importantly, how we can turn the situation around for great relationships. My guest today is Diana Chandra. She's head of counseling at Eagles Mediation and Counseling Center, or EMCC, and Diana is going to give us more information about how we can go about doing this. Diana, great to have you here with us.
Hi Angela.
Let's talk a little bit about some common, reasons why conflict tends to happen in relationships. When you talk to your clients or personal examples, what are the common causes of conflict?
Conflicts are very common, isn't it? We all face conflicts. But those who come into the counseling room, they particularly feel very stuck with their conflicts. They can't seem to move on. And they feel that a third party would often be someone who could help them out. Oftentimes we see them coming in with issues like, they're not talking, or when they do talk, they always fight. And sometimes issues revolve not just themselves, but the way they parent their children, or the way they relate to their in-laws or their own parents. And sometimes it's just that they don't want to give in. There's so many reasons why conflicts happen.
And before we go into those reasons, the more common reasons why people actually reach that point of a breakdown in their relationship, maybe we can talk a little bit about, how do we know if the relationship is in that state where you actually need some help, you need an external party to come in? Because conflicts are quite common in relationships. We do disagree from time to time. But how do we know that it's reached kind of a breakdown, as you say?
Well, most times we can get by, right? We have a conflict with a colleague or a loved one, and we can move on. But like you say, when it comes to a point where it's broken down, that's when no matter how much you try, no matter how much you say or what you say, it doesn't seem to move the relationship forward. And the individual, or both individuals, actually feel very alone in their situation. And it seems like nobody is willing to make any amends. And they stay very separated, very isolated in their relationship.
All right, so there's no movement, there's no progress, it's just either stagnant or it's deteriorating. So we want to do something about that. In the case where people do come to you, what are some common issues that tend to lead to the conflict?
Well, sometimes a large number of cases that we see are also about someone having an extramarital affair. And when that happens, it damages the marital relationship very, very deeply. And, one party may come in feeling that they have been so hurt and wanting to do something about it because they still want to save the marriage. I have had, though, individuals who have had the affair themselves coming in because they realize that their marriage is so important to them. And they want to salvage the marriage because they actually still love their wife, they still love their families.
Right. There's also the idea, between a couple especially, I think, especially when you're starting out in the marriage or even throughout the marriage, the idea of money, finances, that's always a big trigger point for conflict. Do you encounter cases like that as well?
Yeah, finances is a big issue among couples, especially when the couples are not transparent about what they spend it on, when they don't know each other's earning power or what they spend it on, and therefore there is a build-up of what did you do with your money, or where is this money going to, and it creates suspicion. And once there's suspicion, there is a lack of trust. And that's how it sort of, these issues hibernate. And it could take just a very small trigger to bring this whole thing blowing up, and it becomes a huge conflict between them.
When you say hibernate, Diana, it's a lot of times sometimes we just want to keep it to ourselves. We don't want to escalate a conflict, especially when, our schedules are so busy, for example. But in the long run, having not had that communication on a regular basis, it actually leads to some kind of meltdown. Perhaps that's why a lot of conflicts are triggered.
That's right. That's right.
Let's talk a little bit about the idea of, other things like expectations, especially when you come into any relationship, whether it's a friendship, a marriage, or anything like that. One party expects certain things, the other doesn't live up to those expectations. Is that a reason why a lot of people end up in conflict as well?
Definitely. I mean, we all come from different backgrounds, right? We are brought up differently. We are told that this is better to do and that's not so good. But when two persons come together from totally different backgrounds, their expectations are different. Even about doing housework. Sometimes, the man has never, I don't want to stereotype this, but, just for example, if a man has never mopped the floor before and the wife is she's also working and she expects some help, then and she's expected to do everything. Of course there is a difference in expectations, And the thing about expectations is that we need to moderate our expectations. We need to be realistic about them too.
That's actually something I think that it might be a challenge for a lot of us, because in the first place we're thinking, why can't the person just live up to our expectations? So perhaps modifying your expectations, is one way to go about it. We're going to find out a little bit more as well about what more we can do in order to prevent relationships from reaching a point where there's a breakdown. Also, what you can do if you're currently experiencing a relationship breakdown on your own, whether it's with your parents, loved ones, or your spouse. Feel free to call in to ask Diana any questions you have. 669-11938. Coming up, we'll find out more about the common mistakes we all make when it comes to leading to conflict. This conversation continues in just a moment.
Reset your relationships in Between Us. Our soulful encounter is always just between us on 938 Live.
Talking all about relationship breakdowns today, how you can prevent that, and also a little bit more about how you can turn that situation around. Talking to my guest today, Diana Chandra, who's Head of Counselling at the Eagles Mediation and Counselling Centre, or EMCC. Diana, we were talking earlier about certain things that tend to lead to a conflict, and that comes from various things like finances, it could be communication, expectations. What are some common mistakes that you always find a lot of your clients making, or even personally sometimes, we all make these mistakes when it comes to conflict?
Well, I think one of the mistakes is just not listening to each other, and that we try to preempt what the other person is saying, and so we butt in and we interrupt a conversation, and we don't really give somebody else the opportunity to really say what they want to say.
What is good listening to you? I mean, as a counsellor, it's something that you have to do as part of the job. You have to hone that skill. But to the rest of us, we always think we're listening. Yeah, I'm listening to your point of view, but are we really? How do we know that?
Well, I think that listening is actually not just listening to content, but listening to really what this other person is trying to say. And that what I mean by that is that I need to hear what are the emotions behind what they're saying.
Right. So it involves something more than just hearing the words. You have to actually be present with that person, right?
We go past the words, actually. And the words are just one of the cues. The more important cue is really looking at the person's face. If you get a chance to actually see how the person is looking at you, the facial expressions, the body language, that tells you a lot more than what they're saying.
Perhaps the tone of voice as well. I mean, something said with a sarcastic tone can be very different from something said in sincerity.
Definitely.
Let's talk a bit about the idea of blame, because when it comes to conflict, that's a huge thing. Are you saying that this is my fault? It's your fault? So there's a lot of that going around, the blame game. How does that actually result in a relationship breakdown, you think?
Well, blaming is almost like criticism, isn't it? So when I criticize somebody, I am putting that person down. I'm saying something that's not pleasant, that's very negative about that person, and in many ways, too, I'm blaming that person. I could also, become defensive, and so I am trying to defend myself. I'm not listening to what the person is saying. I'm not open to feedback. I'm just trying to protect myself so that I will not get hurt, and that's being defensive. The third element about what I'm talking about, I'm making a reference to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which is a Gottman researched base content here that EMCC is propounding, that sometimes apart from being criticizing and being defensive, couples get into a place where they are contemptuous of each other. And by being contemptuous, we are actually putting a person down. We are disregarding them. And that affects the other person's self-esteem quite a bit.
It does seem that in the long run, if you don't keep the criticism in check, both of you have this dynamic where it's really about, oh, you're blaming me, I'm not going to take the blame for it. It comes into this very vicious cycle where you perceive any kind of communication as a blame game.
That's right.
And then it hits, as you say, the idea of not having, having contempt for each other. Is it reversible, though? I mean, you think when you see a couple who has reached a point where they just have absolutely no respect for each other anymore and there's no communication?
Sometimes for the couples, it is hard for them to see that there's any hope. But I think as professionals, we always want to see that there is some hope in their relationship, especially if they have been good friends in the past. And when we tap on their past history of what it was like for them, the fondness and the admiration that they have had for each other, the real, mutual affection that they've had, we can see a lot of hope in that relationship.
A lot of times when you're caught up in that dynamic of having a conflict and being angry and upset with each other, you forget why you had that wonderful relationship to begin with. So a lot of it's really tapping into that kind of shared history that you have. We're going to find out a bit more as well about how you can actually, implement certain techniques or certain strategies into your life as well in order to prevent any small conflicts from snowballing into a huge breakdown in your relationship as well. So my guest today is going to offer us some tips on this. Diana Chandra is here today telling us more about how to handle relationship breakdowns. She's head of counseling at Eagles Mediation and Counseling Center, and we'll continue our chat in just a moment.
Someone to tell it to is a fundamental human need, and what you say stays between us on 938 Live. It's always just between us, all right?
Talking all about why relationships break down today, the common mistakes that we make that perpetuate conflict, and also how we can turn the situation around. My guest today is Diana Chandra. She's head of counseling at the Eagles Mediation and Counseling Center. And Diana, you've been telling us earlier a little bit about the idea of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I mean, that's based on, you mentioned Dr. John Gottman's research on married couples, criticism, defensive,ness, and you also mentioned the idea of contempt. Could you tell us a bit more about what stonewalling is then?
Well, stonewalling is an attempt by an individual to actually protect themselves from being attacked. So what this individual does is actually he goes away from the conflict, whether physically moving himself out of the situation or even emotionally just shutting down. And so when he does that, or when she does that, she is no longer emotionally accessible. So no matter what the other party is trying to do or say, this individual who's stonewalling is not receptive anymore to whatever attempts that's being made. So it becomes almost a deadlock, where this individual is not open.
It does seem that the person's actually in some way resigned his or herself to the situation.
Exactly.
It's kind of giving up, isn't it?
It is. It is giving up. And normally, with the research that's been done, if all 4 of these horsemen are present in a particular relationship, then it's really hard to move this relationship into a more hopeful situation. But it happens gradually, and so we all know what criticism is, and we all do it oftentimes. But when you actually move from one to the other to the point of stonewalling, then this relationship is really in trouble.
So as you're saying, Diana, it's better to kind of catch it early. When you see criticism appearing very often in your relationship, it really helps to kind of take stock of that before it gets into a defensive sort of, a combative sort of relationship. And then, of course, the idea of contempt, once that sits in, it's very difficult to change that mindset. Let's talk a bit about, how we can, kind of catch ourselves when we're being critical. What are some things that we don't realize are actually very critical? Some common things that we say, perhaps you can share with us.
Well, I think that the individual who is being critical or contemptuous, it would be good for that individual to also be aware of what they're doing. But oftentimes we're not, isn't it? We dish that out to somebody else, and the other person is on the receiving end.
Right.
And I think that in a relationship which is secure, or on good terms enough, the other party would want to try and address this, give them some feedback.
Of course, some people might say as well that, I'm not criticizing, I'm just trying to improve the situation. I'm trying to give you constructive criticism. How do we know when the criticism is something that's advancing the relationship versus something that's actually very detrimental to the person's self-esteem?
Well, I see a lot of couples coming in like this. They're saying, oh, but I gave you feedback, and that's meant to be good for us. It's meant to protect you. But the other party is saying that, that really hurts me. I thought that was you being very critical of me. And sometimes they don't see it at all, and they're not listening to each other. And perhaps this is a situation where a counselor, who's really a very neutral party, listening to the two of them, can actually explain what's going on with them and how each of the other perceive the other person's comment.
Right, it does come back down to being, wanting to listen, wanting to take the other's perspective for a while. It's not that you can't give feedback or you can't give criticism, but there's perhaps a way to do it that's healthy, that builds the person up instead of wearing the person down. We can also talk a little bit about, when you mentioned earlier, if you hit that point of where you're stonewalling, you're not very involved emotionally anymore in building that relationship. What are some ways we can actually tap on perhaps a shared history, something that, you really liked about the other person to begin with? How can we start doing that?
I find that when couples come to this stage, when nothing seems to work for them, and they're really quite desperate and sometimes even hopeless, if we as professionals are able to tap into their past, and sometimes, many times actually, they got married with each other because they were in love, isn't it?
Of course, yeah.
At some point they were in love. Some point they really were really good friends. And when we tap on that, and often I've seen this, when you get them to share about their past history, their eyes light up, and they recall the things that they really enjoyed about each other. And that's when the fond memories come about, and that's when the shared meaning that they had then. And I think this is a good way to actually revive some of those good feelings that they had, that they've forgotten.
And it's not a difficult thing to do. I mean, just putting yourself in, a quiet place, a nice environment, perhaps take some time off with each other, just to spend time reminiscing about the good things. That can really change a lot of the way you feel about a person, remove some of the angst, perhaps. We're going to find out a bit more about what you can do in order to maintain a positive relationship. Also, Diana is going to tell us a little bit more about how maybe some examples of how counseling has actually helped out, some of the clients as well, resolve a relationship breakdown situation, which is what we're talking about today. Any questions? Call us 669-11938. My guest today is Diana Chandra, who's head of counseling at the Eagles Mediation and Counseling Center, or EMCC.
Reset your relationships in Between Us. Our soulful encounter is always just between us on 938 Live.
Chatting today with my guest Diana Chandra, who's head of counseling at Eagles Mediation and Counseling Center, about why relationships break down, the common mistakes we make, and also how we can actually turn the situation around. Now, Diana, tell us a bit more about a couple examples, perhaps, where you've actually worked with a couple who was stonewalling each other, there's a lot of contempt, but things have actually turned around. How does that work out?
I think when the couples begin to realize that they really love each other by looking at their past and their shared meaning that they had together, they also learn that, they need to learn to be open with each other. They need to talk more. They need to be able to validate each other. And when they build these small steps, and they realize that they actually mean a lot to each other. And I think it takes a long time, though, just as much as it takes a long time for them to get to that point where they feel hopeless and the relationship has deteriorated. it also takes as much time to really build it up again once they're in that situation.
So the patience is quite essential. I mean, both of you have to want, to focus on something that's good, a good outcome perhaps that you're working towards. You also have to be patient with each other in getting to that process.
Definitely. I mean, it takes months and years for you to get to know someone and to finally get married to that person. It also takes that much time to really rebuild something that has broken down, where the trust is broken down.
Say you've managed to sit down and talk it out, whether with a counselor or, you've managed to resolve somewhat that impasse that both of you have. What are some, perhaps positive tips that you can give us, Diana, in terms of making sure things don't move from criticism to defensiveness to stonewalling? How can we maintain a good relationship on sort of a daily basis, despite the fact that conflicts are quite inevitable?
Yeah, well, I think that the important thing is to really talk to each other constantly, regularly. And when you're talking, you're not talking about what's for dinner, but you're talking about how are you feeling today, what's going on, and being able to share with each other your hurt points, your vulnerabilities, your hopes and your dreams, where you allow your partner, your spouse, to really see who you really are, rather than trying to project a facade. That's really communication, where you open your heart to each other.
It seems like you need to have the right time and the right sort of space to do this as well, isn't it?
Well, it seems like it's very challenging in our stressful lifestyle. But if couples are able to just factor in just 5 or 10 minutes of that every day, I think that would really help.
Yeah, and 5 to 10 minutes is hardly a lot of time if you think about how many hours you have in the day.
Yeah.
Also, if you want to find out more information in terms of how you can resolve certain conflicts, if you want to find out more about counseling in general, perhaps as a sort of an option for you, if you're currently going through a relationship breakdown, you can go to the Eagles website. It's at www. Or rather, you can actually reach them through the email. It's called reachus@emcc.org.sg, or you can also go to their website, emcc.org.sg, or on Facebook as well. EMCC is right there. Just search EMCC. There is hope. We're going to find out a bit more as well on those various resources. Diana, thank you so much for coming in today and sharing all these
You're so
with
welcome.
us. Diana Chandra is my guest today, Head of Counseling at Eagles Mediation and Counseling Centre. And today we've been discussing why relationships break down and how you can turn that around. Thanks for tuning in.
Someone to tell it to is a fundamental human need, and what you say stays between us on 938 Live.